All right, so the devil. Yeah, it's a way to start October off. So this is the first principles, number 3. This is going to be like a Cliff Note version or the Devil for Dummies book, because obviously you can spend a whole lecture and there's books and books on this, but hopefully it'll be a good introduction of really what is the Bible trying to say with this, so we have a good idea if we're talking to anybody kind of outside the truth. So we have some words that we're familiar with. We have some translations to kind of get them on the right path. So that's what we're going to go through here. So we're going to briefly review the mortal soul and hell again, because you can't really go through devil unless you kind of briefly review that. And some of this will be for the third time, so we'll go fast. And I go fast anyway. And then we're going to look at the history of the devil. When did the devil really start off as a personification of a thing? How do we get the horns, the red, the goat eyes, the goat tail, the pitchfork? All these things are really only in the last 1,000 years or less where it really became popularized. Because this devil or Satan, it doesn't have a description. Maybe they think it's a fallen angel, but there's no description like what we commonly think about with Satan. So where did that come from? And then, of course, what does the Bible say on all these verses that they link to the devil? Beelzebub, Lucifer, Satan, blah, 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 all these different words that they use to commonly describe this one devil. So brief historical review. And this slide I've shown multiple times, but really this immortal soul, hell, devil, demons, all these things really go thousands of years in pagan religions. The Assyrians, the Babylonians, they all had these different kinds of beliefs in an immortal soul and the afterlife. The Greek historians, especially Plato and Socrates, really popularized it because they wrote a lot about it. So that's where it became popularized among the general population. And then we get to the early church, especially in the Roman time with Augustine and Eusebius. They're the ones that really pushed it and kind of demanded it to be part of the religion. And so Augustine's name just keeps coming up over and over on any article you look up that has to do with the mortal soul, hell, or the devil. I mean, he was a huge one that had to do with kind of popularizing this and maybe even requiring this as part of the church. If you didn't believe this, you were excommunicated, you weren't considered a Christian. So it's really kind of the gradual process that all these pagan beliefs came into the church. And so this is from that History of Christianity book. There was no popular concept, discussion, or practice of an eternal hell or immortal devil among Jews or Christians until about 400 years after the death of Jesus. So we talked about last time, even Paul was talking about the difference between Sadducees and Pharisees in the Bible. So it's not like they didn't hear of this. It just wasn't popular. It wasn't a mainstream belief until we're about 400 years after. And that's when we start coming up with Augustine and some of these other characters that really popularize these more sparse pagan beliefs into Christianity. So Augustine, again, I think I'm reusing this slide. Since the time of Augustine, so this is 400 AD, Christians have been taught the difference between death and resurrection. So of course they believe you're going to die and they believe Christ is going to resurrect you. But between those parts, what happened? He's the one that solidified that you have an immortal soul and it's either going to paradise or hell. Then you're going to get resurrected and judged, which makes zero sense because you've already have your judgment depending on where your immortal soul went. But that really got solidified under Augustine. And so they say by far the main person responsible for making this eternal hell was Augustine. We also have Gregory the Great, or Pope Gregory. He's really credited with kind of giving the devil personality and the rules. So he extensively wrote about the devil and demonic temptations, portraying him as a fallen angel and the ruler of a lesser corrupted realm. And so from this, there's this professor from Cambridge and Yale, Old Testament studies. They have some interesting stuff. They say they're Christians, but I almost want to know what they really believe because a lot of the writings fall right in with what we believe. I'm sure only on Old Testament. But this Gregory the Great, or Pope Gregory, his detailed understanding of the devil influenced later medieval depictions of his figure in the role in temptation. So that this figure, starts you off with little sins and works you into bigger sins, and he's trying to corrupt you and steal your soul. Gregory the Great's the one who really started pushing the writings on this and solidifying it. And Gregory the Great just came after Augustine, so I think he took over a lot of Augustine's preaching on this stuff. And then, as we talked about before, many of the things with devil movies come from Dante's Inferno and come from Milton's Paradise Lost, just writings. Kind of earlier writings where they describe the layers of hell and they describe what it might be like for your soul in purgatory. So a lot of these just came from writers too. So it's a step-by-step gradual progression how we get our current day devil and hell of what we think about it or what the world thinks about it. So how does the devil end up looking like this? There's many descriptions of the devil. The most classic and the oldest ones, he's got goat's hooves, he's got horns, his skin's red, carries a pitchfork, he's got cat or goat-like eyes. So you have this common kind of perception of what the devil looks like. And surprise to all of us, this really started around the time of St. Augustine and the Eusebius, around that 400 or 500 AD. And I found a bunch of really good videos on this that they stole pagan gods to come up with this devil. I've got a small video I'm going to show. It's just a real tiny one, but it's kind of trying to link the Greek god Pan to our current manifestation of what the devil is.
The devil is a lie. In ancient times, Pan, the playful Greek god of nature, was adored. But then came Christianity. To solidify its power, it twisted Pan's image into that of Satan. The horns, the hooves, all stolen from Pan, the symbol of wild freedom. Imagine this, a loving nature deity transformed into the ultimate evil. Why? Control and fear. By demonizing Pan, Christianity sought to erase pagan beliefs and enslave minds. So next time you think of the devil, remember you're looking at Pan, a victim of history's greatest smear campaign.
Ooh. But what's interesting about it, here's some earlier Pan, and there's just article after article after article where they're like, yeah, this is pretty objective. Pan, or the devil as we see it, definitely came from Pan. Because like you have all these other deities, they had statues and they had, these big temples. And Christianity could say, it's evil, we can tear that down. But this Pan didn't have all that. So like, how are we going to take this loving pagan god Pan, who's a good god, and we're going to evilize him? So now we're going to start equating this Pan into this evil devil. You can't worship, you can't follow this. This is an evil manifestation. There's some really interesting articles and like 30-minute videos on this and who exactly did it. But can we guess who was in charge of this? Well, from a couple different articles, St. Augustine of Hippos of the 4th century was probably the first to start demonizing Pan. Hey, you guys can't follow these pagan religions. If you follow these pagan religions, you're not going to follow us. So this good Pan, we're going to take a lot of his characteristics and we're going to translate that into this devil Satan concept. And then this Eusebius of Caesarea took things even further and officially made the connection between Pan and Satan, thus solidifying the iconic image of the devil as a man-goat hybrid entity of pure nightmare. And so it's interesting. I mean, you just look up Pan and the devil, and there'll be tons of scholarly articles and books, and it's not like anybody's even disputing it. And they can actually go and show how the characteristics of the devil were specifically taken from different Greek gods. So it's just interesting. I mean, anybody wants to argue this, I don't know how they could. There's tons of evidence showing this, and nobody's denying it because they're like, well, Satan's a spirit, so I mean, we have to just come up with what he would look like, but he still exists. That's how they try to justify it. But I thought that was pretty interesting. So let's quickly review what we've talked about with the mortal soul and hell, and then we'll get deep into the devil's hell. So where in the Bible are the words immortal and soul found together? Pop quiz for the kids, even though you guys won't be able to hear. Where is immortal soul found in the Bible? It's never found in the Bible together. Soul is one thing, immortal is only 6 times, but never is it found together in the Bible. There's 2 words translated to soul in the whole Bible. There's a Hebrew word, which means a living, breathing creature. It can be a person, could be an animal. The exact same meaning in a Greek word. Does anybody remember the 2 words used for soul in the Bible? Yeah, nephesh and suke. Yeah, so nephesh was the Hebrew word, and then suke was the Greek word. Both of these, every time you see soul in the Bible, it's going to be one of these 2. And the definition is a living, breathing creature. So we went through that last time. It could be the animals from the Garden of Eden. It could be any living thing, not even human, not only human. So I put a couple more examples just to refresh this. From Genesis, and to every beast of the earth, to every fowl of the air, to everything that creepeth upon the earth, therein is life, or nephesh. And man became a living soul, not an immortal soul, just a living, breathing being. And they smote all the souls that were in with the edge of the sword. So they took their life from them. And even Mary said, my soul. So now we're in Greek, though, instead of nephesh or suke, doth magnify the Lord. And greater love of no man than this, lay down his life for his friend. So all these examples, we can kind of come up with these, and nowhere does it even imply immortal. It's just basically the breath of life. Immortal only occurs 6 times in the New Testament. Does anybody remember the words for these? I didn't remember the words for these. There's 2 of them. They're only mentioned 6 times in the whole New Testament, and it has to do mostly with Jesus preaching. So it's either athanasia or apheritos, which means you're deathless or immortal or incorruptible. And really, it refers to God 3 times and refers to our final resurrection 3 times. So that's the only time they're mentioned, never with suke or nephesh. So they're separate. That's a quick review. And then how about hell? So does anybody remember the 2 words for hell? There's a Hebrew and Greek word. Yeah, Sheol and Hades. So Sheol was Hebrew, Hades, which is another name some people use for Satan, actually, which is kind of weird. Instead of just hell, some people are Hades, the great leader. So if you were condemn someone to Sheol or Hades, it would simply say they're going to die. They're going to go down to the grave. I think I put this on in the hell one, but this is from pagan Christianity from these 2 authors. And nothing like eternal lake of fire or hell was even remotely suggested to Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel, Noah, Abraham, Lot, Moses, David, Solomon, Daniel. In fact, the concept was never even mentioned to the worst offenders in the Bible. There are also no Old Testament warnings about the need to repent in order to avoid eternal suffering after death. So this is some Christians writing a book saying this concept wasn't even there. So how are we coming up with this? This concept of this immortal soul or anything after death wasn't there. And then we have one more a lot of times that they use for hell. We have Hades and Sheol, and there was a third one that Christ used a lot. Yeah, and it was Gehenna. So at the time, Gehenna was a valley kind of down from the 1st century temple. And this is where they would sacrifice people to the false gods. And eventually they went in and they turned it into a burning heap, basically where all the trash goes. So if we look at the description of Gehenna or the valley of slaughter, we have a couple different verses in the Bible. So the first one was Jeremiah 7:31. And they have built the high places of Tophet, which is the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and daughters in fire, which I commanded them not, neither came it into my heart. Therefore, behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that it shall no longer be called Tophet, nor the valley of the son of Hinnom, but the valley of slaughter. So that's from Jeremiah. And then King Josiah in 2 Kings played a crucial role in reforming the valley of Hinnom by ending the practice of child sacrifice, and he transferred it into this burning garbage dump, kind of outside of the city, because of all the pagan rituals. So this transformed from a physical location to a symbol of divine judgment. So if they know this is where everything goes to die, to burn, it's a wasteland, then Christ uses this symbology, this Gehenna word, to kind of represent that burning end. And so it's only used 12 times. It's always symbolically. I think 10 of the 12 times it's Christ using it. So one of the examples I just pulled up there from Matthew 5:29, and if thy right eye offend me, pluck it out and cast it from thee. For it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, than that the whole body should be cast into hell. And this particular hell was Gehenna. So most of these examples are very specific to the times. And they would have understood what this meant, this Gehenna. You're throwing into this what was pagan burning trash pit area. And so all these make a lot of sense if we know the root words, we know what word this hell is being translated from, one of these 3 words. So 2 words mean just pretty much grave, and then one was a physical location that was used as symbolic punishment. And so these are our 3 hell words that we have throughout the Bible. That was my fast review. Okay, then we get into the devil. So we got the immortal soul. Soul means breath or life or body. Immortal never applies to that. We've got the 3 words for hell, which basically means the grave. So now we've got the devil. We're finally getting started. So I pulled up some definitions here because this is typically what you're going to think about in the modern world when you look at devil. So the top one's from Webster's Dictionary. So the devil is often capitalized. The personal supreme spirit of evil, often represented by in Christian belief as the tempter of humankind, the ruler of all apostate angels, and the ruler of hell. So that's kind of what you typically think about when you think about this devil, the Satan. I'm not going to read everything on the bottom here, but this is from a 1737 Bible concordance that talks about what is the devil. And it's kind of just saying the same thing. So I highlighted some of the big ones. By collecting passages where devil or Satan is mentioned in the Bible, and we'll go through some of these passages, it is very clear that he fell from heaven, that God cast him down. By his enraged malice, sin, death, and ever evils came to this world. So, because of the devil, evils came to the world, and that's why we sin. It has nothing to do with us. It's the devil influencing us. And God makes use of him to prove good men. He chastises bad men, but his utmost endeavors is to rob God of his glory and men of their souls. So basically, they're just putting all of our temptations, sin of the flesh, into this external devil. And this is 1737. So this was already set up pretty strongly. So there's a lot of flaws in the theory. Just a few that why would God even allow this? So we already need to overcome sin in the flesh. I mean, if we read the Bible, we kind of understand that's a big part of it. So why would now we also have to overcome this immortal, what was angel, godlike creature that's trying to tempt us? I mean, we have no chance if we have to fight both of these. Oh, look at these glasses are ridiculous. So a couple verses I pulled up that just kind of goes with that. Genesis 6:3, man's wickedness was great and that his thoughts were evil continually. No mention of a devil giving us these thoughts. Jeremiah, the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. And then we look at Mark, for from within, out of the heart of men, proceed evil thoughts, adulteries, fornications, murders, thefts, covetousness, wickedness, deceit, lasciviousness, evil eye, blasphemy, pride, foolishness. All these evil things come from within and defile the man. And there's tons of verses that show that. This is part of the Adamic condemnation, the sin in the flesh. This is not, there's no need for a devil with any of these, and there's no mention of that either. So why, one, would God allow this? And it doesn't seem like he does if we read the Bible. But two, how could we sin once we have put on incorruption and made equal to angels? So if we want to be resurrected and judged and become like unto the saints, become a saint, become immortal, and yet we could still, disobey God and get thrown into hell, that's not very promising. We're right back where we started. So it doesn't make any sense. Luke 20:35. But they which shall be accounted worthy to obtain the world and the resurrection of the dead, neither marry or given in marriage, neither can they die anymore, for they are equal unto the angels. So that doesn't give us a whole lot of hope if we're going to be equal to the angels, but yet we can fall. And then a lot of the writers talk about this. They're like, well, it can't happen anymore. Things have changed. Back during the creation, the angels could sin against God. But now, of course, we can't. And I'm like, well, where are you getting this from? You can say anything you want, but do you have anything to back it up with? So it's ridiculous. And then I put in Hebrews 2 that through the death, Christ might destroy him that has the power of death, that is the devil, or sin in the flesh. So there's a lot of flaws in the theory. This is just a few that we kind of come up with. So this was interesting. When I was putting up my definitions to try to say what the world believes in Satan and the devil, I pulled up the World History Encyclopedia, and it gave me the opposite, which is really interesting. I was going to use that as like, here's Webster's dictionary, here's what they say about the devil. But the World History of Encyclopedia has this to say. That's why I apologize. These are horrible slides, too many words, but this is great. So there's 3 different paragraphs I took out of this big long thing. But the World History Encyclopedia says Satan or devil is one of the best known characters in Western traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. Surprisingly, this entity was a late comer in the ancient world. Satan, as a totally evil being, is nowhere found in the Jewish Bible. He evolved during the height of the Persian Empire and was adopted by Jews living under Persian rule at the time. His former name, Satan, derives from the Hebrew Ha Satan. Ha means the, and Satan means opposer or adversary, which we'll go through. The name described his eventual function as the opposer of God's creation. So the Greek diabolos, English devil, means accuser, slanderer, again describing his role. The concept of Satan emerged over time and in phases. So I was like, oh, this is pretty interesting. This is an encyclopedia. And then it goes on later in the article. When Jerusalem was conquered and destroyed by the Neo-Babylonian Empire, some Jews were taken into captivity in Babylon, and we're familiar with this. Cyrus the Great then conquered the Babylonians in 550 and established the Persian Empire. The state of Persia was Zoroastrianism, founded by the prophet Zoroaster. And Zoroastrianism, they say, was kind of a monotheistic religion where there is one God. It wasn't Yahweh, but there is one God. But it's really focused on good versus bad, yin and yang. So if you think good and you do good acts and you do good deeds, you will be saved, versus evil acts and evil deeds. But there was good and bad demons. So it wasn't exactly what we'd think of monotheistic, but it was really the good versus the bad. And so some of these guys say, well, this is why Cyrus was so open for people, going into their own religions, as long as they were doing good and they were being good, kind of like we have today, kind of a humanistic approach. So if they think he was more of this Zoroastrianism or Zoroism, that he was a little more open to other religions as long as there's just good and bad and you're trying to do good deeds. So I thought that was interesting, you know. So Cyrus permitted the Jews to return to Jerusalem, although some stayed. They took many elements of Asian Persian religion, ancient Persian religion with them, and they merged the personification of chaos with earlier views of Satan. Now he was just shortened to Satan and the Greek diabolos, or the devil, and the Jews began assigning all evil to Satan instead of God. And then he goes through all these different writings of historians that really show from about this Persian Empire on, a lot of this gets contributed, instead of the sin of the flesh or man, it gets contributed to Satan or diabolos or some external being. So it was interesting. So I couldn't use this as a typical definition of Satan because I thought, oh wow, this is actually pretty good. Good job, world history. Encyclopedia. Okay, so what does the Bible say? And they already talked about that a little bit when it comes to the devil. So we have multiple words that are translated as devil. First, we have the Hebrew word. Here we go again. The Hebrew word Satan. And Satan basically means to oppose an adversary and accuser. Resist, withstand. The ones mostly use is adversary or an accuser is a Satan. Anything. And we'll give examples where God and Peter, there's tons of examples. Anytime you're an adversary to whatever you're thinking or doing, or you accuse somebody, you're a Satan. And then we switch over to the Greek, and then we have diabolos, which is dia and balian, which means to throw or tear apart. So generally a diabolos, similar but not exactly the same, is a false accuser, slanderer, calumniator, deceiver, liar, just that kind of, I guess that's adjective. So they're similar, but they're not exactly the same. So we have Satan, we have diabolos, and then we have the third word, daemon. So all three of these are translated devil in the Bible, depending on which version you have. And daemon is a Greek word used for those who believe in spirits that can enter the body and afflict them with various diseases. For thousands of years, and I got archaeology on this, for thousands of years, anytime somebody was sick or possessed, it was from a demon. So you would look at them and say, okay, you have runny nose, you have red eyes, you're going to die, and this is the demon that's possessing you. So this was the mainstream thought for quite a long time. So this was the mainstream thought during this time. So Christ uses this symbology, not necessarily endorsing it or believing it, but anytime they think you're sick, you're ill, you're mentally ill, there's a daemon, you're demonic, you're possessed by some kind of demons. And so we use this, and Christ uses this in the Bible, which would have made a lot of sense to people at the time. So the confusion, though, is all these separate words, Satan, diabolos, daemon, even some other ones, are all translated devil. They're all devil in the Bible, especially if you get one of the more, lenient translations, not necessarily King James, where everything's devil. But these words need to be understood and kept distinct. And one thing to keep in mind, this diabolos and Satan is never applied to demonics as descriptive of their condition. So they never put those two together. It's because of Satan or diabolos that you're now, demonic, or you're possessed by demons, or they're kept separate, which is important to know, even though they're all loosely translated devil. So again, the Hebrew word Satan is to oppose an adversary, resist. So even God is mentioned as Satan, and there's tons of verses, but I pulled up some that I thought were pretty good. So I'm just going to go through these four. So first is Numbers 22, where we have Balaam and the ass. And God's anger is kindled because he went. And the angel of the Lord stood in the way for and this they transferred adversary, or Satan. So you have a devil. So the angel of the Lord stood in the way for a devil against him. Now he was riding upon his ass, and his two servants were with him. Well, in this case, it only makes sense to put adversary, but it is Satan. It's the Hebrew Satan. And so in this case, an angel of the Lord was acting like the devil or Satan, if we keep going along this logic. 1 Corinthians 21:1, Satan stood up against Israel and provoked David to number Israel. So this is the classic one. So Satan provoked David to number Israel. But if we look at a parallel count from 2 Samuel 24:1, and again, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he moved David against them to say, go number Israel and Judah. So we have parallel accounts, and one, it's just Satan that stood up against Israel and provoked David, and the other one, it says it's the Lord. So it's clear that the Lord was Satan in this case, an adversary to what David wanted to do. So this doesn't make any sense with some kind of supernatural devil that has, taken your immortal soul, burning in hell. And even David blames himself. So if we keep going to 2 Samuel 24, verse 10, and David's heart smote him after he had numbered the people. And David said to the Lord, I have sinned greatly, and that what I have done. And so David takes blame for that. He doesn't blame some kind of superficial other being. And that's what that one author was saying in that pagan book, that nowhere in the Bible does anybody blame anybody else on this kind of stuff, especially if you go in the Old Testament. So another example with Satan is when Jesus rebukes Peter as a Satan. When Christ is talking, he's eventually going to have to die in Mark 8:33. And when he had turned about and looked at his disciples, he rebuked Peter, saying, "Get thee behind me, Satan, for thou savorest not the things that be of God, but the things that be of men." So is he calling Peter the supernatural devil? No, nobody would even think that unless somebody put that in your head. He's being an adversary to Christ, what Christ is saying to them. He's trying to oppose what Christ is saying needs to happen for salvation. So I think these make perfect sense if we're not already biased thinking there's going to be some supernatural devil with these verses. So what about Job? Job is a big one. A lot of articles and they talk about Satan. There's a lot of YouTube videos. Well, clearly Satan exists. Just read Job. If you haven't read Job, then. So let's read Job. So I'm going to read, and I put it up on the screen, Job chapter 1, 6 through 12. But then in this book, The Devil is Origin and End by Thomas Williams, there's some good articles in here. So I'm just going to read a couple paragraphs because it sums it up really nice. But if we review Job chapter 1, verse 6 through 12 up on the screen. Now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan came also with them. So we have the sons of God and Satan. And the Lord said unto Satan, "Whence comest thou?" And Satan answered the Lord and said, "From going to and forth on the earth, and from walking up and down in it." And the Lord said to Satan, "Hast thou considered my servant Job? And there is none like him in the earth, a perfect and upright man, one that feareth God and escheweth evil." And Satan answered the Lord and said, "Doth Job fear God for naught? Hast thou now made a hedge about him, and about his house, and about all that he hath on every side? And you bless the work of his hands, and the substance is increased in the land. But put forth thy hand now, and touch all that he hath, and he will curse thee to thy face." And the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all that he hath is in thy power. Only upon himself put not forth thy hand." So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. So, when we first read this, it does seem like he's talking to some kind of powerful being, if you already have that bias in your head. But this, from this particular book, there's a quote in here that's really interesting. I'm just going to read it. So this is from an article called Diabolism by Edward Turney. And Thomas Williams even says, I'm just going to quote this guy. It's good enough. I'm not going to try to repeat it. So I'm going to quote the guy. And so this is from the book Diabolism by Edward Turney. Get some light here. So what it says is, and this is referring to Job, if the reader had not harbored an idea of a supernatural, black, malicious devil taught him from childhood, I venture to assert that out of these verses, it would be impossible for him to invent such a thing. There is no more ground concluding that this Satan is a monster than there is for believing that the sons of God were such in a literal sense. These appear to be Job's family. We might say a company of true believers, while the adversary or Satan was a person of nomadic habits and evidently a hypocrite. It does not at all appear that he was more than an ordinary man, that is, a human being, and it would be a perversion of reason to assume that he was a fallen angel, a supernatural, powerful, malignant thing. It does not even appear that Satan possessed any extraordinary power whatsoever, but was purely permitted to be the instigator of Jehovah to put forth his servant Job to the full proof. Thou movest me against him. The evil which befell Job was not from Satan, but from God. What shall we receive good from the hand of the Lord, that we shall not receive evil? And so it kind of goes on, but even he's saying nobody would consider this to be this supernatural devil, just reading this on its own. It's interesting in the kind of the symbology and the words used, but you wouldn't automatically think, oh, okay, there's some kind of supernatural devil. And even some verses in here say, what good or what evil happens that didn't come from the Lord. It never blames it on some separate type of Satan or immortal being. So we have diabolos, meaning a false accuser, and there's tons of verses on this. And so from John, Jesus answered them, have I not chosen one of you? Have I not chosen you 12? And one of you is a devil or a diabolos or a false accuser, deceiver. Kind of makes sense. Jesus, when he was out in the wilderness, was tempted by the devil. So what was he tempted by? He was tempted by sin in the flesh. The deceiver, the liar, going against what he knew he shouldn't have done, but not a separate devil. I got one more thing to read from this book. I thought that was pretty good too. So on page 21 of the same book, there's an anonymous author that wrote about the diabolos that Thomas Williams talks about. And they don't know who wrote this. And he was not a Christadelphian, but he was just kind of going through a historian. And so this is pretty interesting when you look at diabolos. and this isn't that long. In 1842, there was a book anonymously published on the subject of the devil. The author was evidently a scholar, and he treated this subject masterly and elaborately. This book was republished by Brother Thomas Nisbet of Glasgow, Scotland, to whom we're indebted for a copy. So it goes on. After giving a list of many passages where a diabolos occurs, the author comes to this conclusion. What then is the word rendered devil in this passage? It is diabolos. What does it mean? It's derived from diabolo. This itself being compounded or made up of two words. Dia mean through and balo to strike, as we kind of talked about. Diabola therefore signifies to pierce through, as when a man's character is attacked by false charges, or another is of another, his character is pierced through with darts of calumny. And as the idea of this calumny implies that the accusations are false, the words diabolos means a false accuser, a calumniator. The proper meaning of diabolos is therefore should always be false accuser, a calumniator. The improper meaning on this is devil. This improper interpretation, having first given by the translators into Greek, is nowhere else sampled by any Greek author. And he goes on to kind of go through these different examples in the Bible that where they put devil, you could easily put calumniator or false accuser. That fits perfectly everywhere. Where devil doesn't fit, what do? Well, they go ahead and put the other term. They go ahead and put false accuser or liar, something like that. Kind of like with hell and everything else. If it doesn't fit your narrative, you put the correct word and definition in it. All right. Then we got daemon, which we talked about. This was the thoughts of the time. Anytime you're ill, you have this demon that's possessing you, because why else would you get ill? Why else would you be crazy? Because you have a demon. So the Greek lexicon, when talking about daemon, the Greek word, a lesser god, a spirit of a departed human who had power to possess a person and inflict them. So when we read this, we're kind of reading sort of like a modern day idiom, which I put some in there, like you have a screw loose, you're letting the cat out of the bag, putting the wool over your eyes. The difference is we're just using that as an expression. They're using it as an expression, but they also kind of believed it. They really believed there was a demon that was possessing them. So when Christ talks about this, it makes sense. He's using the language of the time that the people would understand, but he's not endorsing there's a demon possessing you. And so we're looking at some examples of that. But first, I have to get into archaeology because it fascinates me. So this just kind of proves this, daemon. So there's this old Babylonian, of course, this goes back over 3,000 years. And this treatise of medical diagnosis and prognosis, which is called the Sakhaku, is these tablets that the early Babylonians put together, and it's actually their first sort of medical record. It will describe, if you have these symptoms, this is how you treat it, this is the demon that possesses you. So I found a short video on this. I won't play the whole thing, and this guy's voice is annoying as anything, but he explains it pretty well. So I think this is kind of interesting. And this would fit in perfectly with this concept of the daemon that Christ refers to in the Bible.
This is the Sakhaku, 40 tablets, 3,000 diagnoses, compiled around 1050 BCE by a man named Esagil Kinapli, and it might be the first real medical textbook in human history. But it's not like the medical books we know today. It's got no long explanations, no theories. It's just efficient. A list of symptoms, then the divine cause, and then a prognosis. If the eyes are red, and the face is swollen, and the chest is warm, that's the hand of the god Gula, and the man will recover. If the nose leaks, the tongue turns yellow, and he speaks nonsense, he has the hand of a ghost, and he will die. Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit odd, but this wasn't all just guesswork. There was a system here. They were observing symptoms, comparing outcomes, and recording patterns across literal generations. This wasn't just folk healing in the village square. This is the end result of professional scholars, scribes, each trained for years in cuneiform, pattern matching.
This is... You get the point. So anyway, there's a lot of archaeological evidence that kind of goes back on this, that this was the textbook of the time for thousands of years, and it was demons. They didn't understand enough of the modern medicine, so they would assume they still collected signs and symptoms, and some of their treatments were actually decent. And they go through different herbs and really archaic surgery. So they did other things too, but it was always a demon. How do you get rid of the demon? So it makes a lot of sense when we take that context into the Bible when they're talking about daemon. So in this context, let's look at a few examples. And this goes right into Beelzebub. Beelzebub is another name for the devil, but that kind of fits within this daemon category. So if we look at Matthew 9:32, a lot of these are the same things, but as they went out, behold, they brought to him a dumb man possessed with a devil. And of course, this devil is Daimon. And the devil was cast out, and the dumb spake, and the multitudes marveled, saying, it was never so seen in Israel. But the Pharisees said, he cast out devils through the prince of the devils. And Jesus went about all the cities and villages, teaching in the synagogues and preaching the gospel of the kingdom and healing every sickness and every disease among the people. So, of course, that's what they're going to think. If at the time they think every illness, mental or physical, is from a demon, of course they're going to say he's casting out devils. And that would make sense with what they thought in the language of the time. And even, I might read this one, even the account in Luke where he drives the devils out into the swine, it's kind of the same thing. Everybody's freaking out. Let's see if I can pull this up. Luke 8. 27 through 34. Luke 8. I'm having so and he went forth to land. There met him out of the city a certain man which had devils a long time, and wore no clothes, neither abode in any house, but in the tombs. And when Jesus saw, he cried out and fell down before him with a loud voice, saying, what have I to do with thee, Jesus, thy Son of God Most High? I beseech thee, torment me not. For he had commanded the unclean spirit to come out of the man, for oftentimes it had caught him. And he was kept bound with chains and in fetters, and he brake with bands, and was driven into the devil of the devil into the wilderness. And Jesus asked him, saying, what is thy name? And he said, Legion, because many devils were entered into him. And they besought him that he would not command them to go out into the deep. But there was a herd of many swine feeding in the mountain, and they besought him that he would suffer them to enter into the land, and he suffered them. And then the devils went out of the man and entered the swine, and the ran had violently down a steep place in the lake and were choked. And so we're kind of familiar with the story, but so this kind of goes with that symbology. There is these demons, this thing that's possessing them that Jesus transferred into the swine. So what about Beelzebub? If we look at Beelzebub, this is a Philistine god of Ekron, and they're named throughout the Bible. Let me move this down. 2 Kings 1. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I didn't actually know this till I didn't realize, I guess I forgot that Beelzebub, I thought it was just, I don't know what I thought. I don't think I realized this is the Philistine god that they refer to. So if we look at 2 Kings, chapter 1, I'm just going to read the first few verses. And this is when Elijah denounces Ahijah. Then Moab rebelled against Israel after the death of Ahab. And Ahijah fell down through a lattice in his upper chamber and was in Samaria and was sick. And he sent messengers and said to them, go inquire of Beelzebub, the god of Ekron, whether I shall recover. And of course, that didn't turn out too well when he's going to inquire of a false god. So Beelzebub was this Philistine false god. So, and we know about Daimon when they think everybody who's sick is possessed with demons. So now it sort of makes sense when they're saying, oh, Prince of Beelzebub. So now when we go back to Matthew, so Beelzebub is interpreted the Prince of Demons. It's also kind of, they say it's another name for the devil, this general devil. So we go to Matthew 24 or 12. But when the Pharisees heard it and said, this doth not cast out devils, but by Beelzebub, the prince of the devils, the scribes say, he is possessed by Beelzebub. By the prince of demons, he is driving out demons. And then Luke. But some of them said he casted out devils through Beelzebub, the chief of the devils. And of course, this is the daemon word, the Greek word. So this sort of follows just great. They're just naming. They're naming one specific god that they think might be creating this illness that Christ is casting out. So that's just another word we hear now and then, but it's just a specific Philistine god, a demon that could possess and give you issues. So I think this fits beautifully with the daemon concept. Almost done. How about Lucifer? So when I was looking up Lucifer, because Lucifer is another one. Oh, another name for Christ, you fallen star, you fallen angel. Well, in the NET Bible commentary, they sum it up beautifully. I don't even really have to get into it. I was, again, looking for something that tries to explain why Lucifer's the fallen angel. But they just say, well, actually, this is what the Bible says. So this is direct out of the NET Bible commentary. There is no doubt about it that Isaiah 14, which speaks of Lucifer, is referring to the king of Babylon. And then they say, Isaiah 14:4, thou shalt take up this proverb against the king of Babylon and say, how hath the oppressor ceased, the golden city ceased? In fact, the name Lucifer doesn't even appear in the Hebrew text. The Hebrew behind this translation consists of 3 words: Hallel, son of Shakar, which is probably a name for the morning star Venus. So it's translated as son of the morning star by most translations. But the translation of Lucifer was carried over from the reading in Jerome's Latin Vulgate, not the Hebrew text. If you remember with the hell, a lot of these misinterpretations were from the Latin Vulgate. That's where a lot of these came in, and then they snuck over to other Greek and English translations. So a lot of it really comes from Jerome's biased Bible translation. The whole section is directed to the king of Babylon, who is clearly depicted as a human ruler. The king of Babylon is taunted for having unrealized delusions of grandeur. Some Christians have seen this as allusion to the fall of Satan, but this seems contextually unwarranted. So even this Christian Bible commentary is like, this doesn't make any sense. It's pretty clear who this is talking about. This isn't sometimes they think this is like symbology of Lucifer being fallen Satan, but then they can't back up where they're getting that from. So Lucifer is only mentioned one time. It's only in Isaiah, but it's interesting when we look at the parallels. So Isaiah is actually Isaiah, and this is about 150 plus or minus years before Nebuchadnezzar even existed and is taking over. So this is a prophecy. So Isaiah is making a prophecy. For thou hast said in thine heart, I will ascend into heaven, I will exalt my throne above the stars, I will sit upon the mount of the congregation and the sides of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds, I will be like the Most High. Thou shalt be brought down to hell, Sheol, to the sides of the pit. So he's making a prophecy before this guy even lived. Now we go to Dan when Nebuchadnezzar is starting to do it. And the king said, is not this great Babylon that I have built for the house of the kingdom of my might, of my power, and for the honor of my majesty? And while the word was in the king's mouth, a voice fell from heaven saying, O King Nebuchadnezzar, the kingdom is departed from me. And this is when he's a wild animal for about 7 years, which interestingly enough, there's a 7 to 10 year gap in historical evidence in Babylon archaeology, which is really interesting. It might be something I'm going to look into later, because isn't this interesting how this parallels the Bible? Anytime something bad happens or they lose a battle, there's this gap of missing information. And there happens to be a gap that would correlate perfectly with this timeline, which is really cool. I think it's cool. Okay, and the last one. And then we got the serpent, because the devil's first introduced to us in Genesis. Duh, we all know that. That's where we get introduced to the devil. So let's go through that. The serpent in Genesis 3, or the serpent in Genesis. So in Genesis 1:31, and God saw that all he had made, and it was very good. So where's the mention of the devil? If he had an angel that fell from heaven and was fighting against him, I don't think God would say that was very good. That would be a non-successful creation in my book. So it's really interesting that he says everything was very good. But then when we talk about the serpent, now the serpent was more subtle than any beast of the field which the Lord God had made. So I mean, he's already saying what's going on here. And the Lord... Then we go to Genesis 3:14. And the Lord God said unto the serpent, because thou hast done this, thou art cursed above the cattle and every beast of the field. Upon thy belly shall go, and dust shall eat all the days of thy life. So blame went to the serpent. The serpent was considered a beast of the field, not the devil. And his punishment sounds nothing like this immortal, eternal devil living in hell. So it really doesn't make any sense. And we still have Christian authors who are like, yeah, it doesn't make any sense. So this is John Day. I've used him a lot. He's an Oxford Old Testament professor. He's a Christian. I tried to look him up, see what he believes, because he believes so much similar stuff that, I don't know, I find it interesting. But this is right out of one of his writings. The serpent in the Garden of Eden is popularly equated with the devil. However, modern scholars agree that this was a later identification and is not the original meaning, though there is no consensus as to what the original background of the serpent was. For Adam and Eve, the serpent in the Garden of Eden represent the voice of temptation, but it needs to be noted that for the original writer, the serpent was not equated with Satan or the devil. The concept of Satan was later only developed when we find him equated in these 2 books, the Book of Wisdom and the Book of Enoch. Neither one is in the canon that we use. So isn't that interesting? I didn't even consider this until much later, into books we don't even use in our Bible. So I thought that was pretty good. All right, so here's our review. Okay, good. So we have 1 Hebrew word and 2 Greek words. Satan, diabolos, is an adversary, a false accuser. Daimon is what we're talking about when they thought somebody was ill. You're casting out your demons, you're demonic, because at the time, illness had to come from demonic possessions. And then we have Lucifer, which is Isaiah's basically prophecy about the king of Babylon. We have the serpent in the garden, which we don't know, but it was a serpent that was a beast of the field that was cursed. And then we have Beelzebub, which is a Philistine god of Ekron, which would just be a specific example of the daemon possessions. So the modern day devil concept was not fully developed or believed by most Christians or Jews until the time of the Persian Empire. The second temple, that's what we're talking about, Cyrus, was Zoroastrianism that started kind of creeping in. But then it really didn't come until the end of the Roman Empire when you have Augustine and Eusebius and Pope Gregory and all those guys that really started writing it and demanding it being part of the faith. And the appearance of the devil seems to be mostly equated to different gods, but mostly on Pan. They really said that they pushed this Pan, so Pan would get pushed away from pagan, and it would be this evil personification for the Christian church. So my conclusion is kind of a cluster, and I apologize, but I just want to put some thoughts down why this doesn't make sense. So Jesus came to destroy the devil or sin in the flesh. Sin equals death. We don't need this external, we definitely don't need this external temptation of this immortal being. We have enough issues with ourselves, just with our flesh. By one man sin entered into the world, by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. The wages of sin is death. And then Paul has that whole chapter where he talks about, in my flesh dwelleth no good thing. What I would do, I do not. What I would not do, I do. And that whole thing that goes down. I mean, he's talking about struggling with the inner and the outward man. Definitely the flesh, his body, his nature, not this immortal devil. If it existed, Paul would probably talk about him. Christ was manifest to take away our sins. He was made as we are, with the same flesh and blood as Adam, tempted in all points like we are, but yet without sin. And that was necessary, as we read in Hebrews, that he might condemn sin in the flesh, and by his death he might destroy him that has the power of death, that is, this devil or this sin in the flesh.